What's up, everybody? Welcome to Dojo. This is a Dojo container in the container of the Broom Radio, which is effectively a podcast, but also I would say a podcast which is produced by a community called The Broom, which you can find out more about at thebroom.us, and you can follow us on YouTube and Spotify and Apple Podcasts and anywhere else you can see or play podcasts which are available via RSS. And you can also find out about how to join the community at thebroom.us. I would say that the community for now takes place inside a Discord server, which is of course in some ways like where a lot of online communities gather nowadays when they need, I would say, like a little bit more containment than is available on algorithmic parasocial media platforms like X.com or even Blue Sky and Instagram, etc. and so on. But I'm here today with Maija Haavisto, also known as Diamond Die, who also has a Discord server, which I would say is a little bit of an enclave outside of like the free for all, which is algorithmic parasocial media.
Yeah, so I'm Maija, better known as Diamond Eye on many places on the internet, and I live in Sofia, Bulgaria, though I'm Finnish, and I'm a kind of a therapist and do all kinds of woo stuff, and somehow I feel like I have no idea how to introduce myself today, so that was not a great job.
You're a writer.
I'm a writer. I've written a lot of stuff. That's true.
Some of it's about woo-woo stuff, but I'd say like most of it has it. I'd say from my sense is like most of it is either like explicitly fictional and not just like fictional according to people who are materialistic, and then also some of it is very evidentially based, right? Like you would say
Yeah.
it's scientific.
Yeah, that's true. There's a whole bunch of novels, a whole bunch of medical stuff, some spiritual stuff, some poetry, one children's book, which is very fictional.
But I'd say like from my reading of your spiritual stuff, it's not exactly woo. Like how would you go about classifying um the non how would you go about classifying your spiritual writing with regard to the egregore of woo?
Yeah, I would say that my past spiritual writing was more from a kind of Buddhist framework, which has shed along the way more and more until it's like very, very little of it is still there. And I guess for most of my friends who are very woo would classify me as like low woo, and then there are people who feel like I'm super far out because they are not.
Mm. And then something was kind of coming up for me around, like not only like your spiritual writing, but I would say a lot of spiritual writing, which is, I'd say, contingent upon a Buddhist framework, where it's not exactly evidential based in the sense of being able to measure and locate physical phenomena and locate them within so-called causal chains of eventuation. And I guess that's like so-called by me just now. I'm not sure if anybody else ever has used that phrase before. But it's more, I guess it's like less woo in the sense that often this writing is almost historical, right? So it's like, okay, in this lineage, based on the citation of X, it's known that this happened, or they have written about this thing which happened, and so on and so forth. Is that aligned, I guess, with your sense of your spiritual writing?
I guess to some extent, and I guess I want to add that I do feel like Buddhism is very woo because it's literally a religion, and I'm a bit annoyed that some people somehow feel that like Buddhist stuff is not woo and Christian and whatever stuff is woo, which makes no sense.
Interesting. I'd never really thought about people talking about Christian stuff as being woo.
I mean, I guess it's not really these exact words, but the way many people somehow consider that Buddhism is more fact-based and not really a religion, which is not like 100% untrue, but I feel like it's mostly untrue.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting to me because I was meditating upon this when I was reading the writing and like honestly like the Twitter publishing of an account called I think his name's Ali Alomi. He's like I'll say like a historian of medieval Islamic astrology. And you know, like you'll see a lot of people talking about astrology in this way where it's like the sun is in Capricorn. This means you need to get your house in order, blah blah blah. Which to me feels more woo than when, say, this Alomi guy whose name I don't feel confident that I'm pronouncing it correctly. He'll say is that, you know, medieval Islamic astrologers used to believe X, Y, and Z. And that feels less woo to me because he's talking about something which has a historical basis, right? Which is to say that it's written down and he's talking about what he's found of their writings versus making a claim which is theoretically at least somewhat falsifiable. If that makes sense. Does the distinction between those two things feel like legible to you?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I've been thinking about things kind of similar to this recently. Like I've been working on a new book and trying to find things to cite and things to reference. And then sometimes it's like, okay, there are people who agree with me, but this is not science. Or then there's something that's technically called a scientific paper, but it's basically a guy who's like, I think this and that.
Mm, mhm. So I guess like what's coming up for me is that we're talking about different flavors of epistemology.
Yes.
Maybe stuff which is based on observations with well constructed sample sizes. It might be like vanilla, and then like historical wood might be like strawberry, and then perhaps like
I thought you would say like this is vanilla and this is like kink, and I was like, what?
I'm thinking that the people who make, you know, claims which are not grounded in like historical fact or in empirical studies might be something like chocolate. But I'm curious how that lands with you, or why I would say something like that.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what's the relevance of those.
um, Neither am I. But yeah, like maybe you can say a little bit more about like what you were writing when you were going through these citations and trying to understand what to cite and what not to cite.
Yeah, so I've been working on this book manuscript, which is about trauma and dissociation, which are subjects very keen. I'm very keen on, and I've written about them in my previous books, but I feel like I haven't really gone deep enough.
Hmm.
And now I'm trying to go deep enough, but this book is not going very well for multiple reasons. but it's like I have a lot of fairly controversial theories, such as that a lot of things that are not seen as trauma-based are actually trauma-based, and then it's nice if I can cite something, even if it's just a ostensibly scientific paper, which is a guy saying I made up this idea.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, what makes those papers like ostensibly scientific to you? Because I feel like I'm familiar with the kind of paper that you're talking about. Like it's something that's perhaps published in a journal, which is usually peer reviewed, but it's not necessarily based on empirical studies. Um,
Yeah.
Sometimes you also find literature reviews in these journals, right?
Yeah, these they are like an academic journal, so technically they are science in some way.
Hmm. And then I feel like there's a way in which they end up inheriting some of like the attentional gravity of actually empirical studies which appear in these papers. But I'm assuming that like when people are trying to figure out whether or not to include these papers in these journals, they at least assess whether or not it's possible to construct an empirical study around some of the hypotheses which these authors are trying to um, put into like the public sphere, right?
Yeah. But I mean, like some of these fields are not even, they're not really trying to be very scientific. Like one of the papers I was citing or thinking about citing said something like, all psychoanalytic practitioners know that the boundaries between humans are porous or something like that, which is like, yeah, it's not really a scientific claim, but it's interesting that you can say something like this in a kind of scientific paper.
Mm. It definitely feels interesting, I would say, in my channel, which is also a pretty unscientific claim. And I guess I'm kind of like meditating on like that specific claim about like the porosity between humans and yeah, like whether it's possible to even construct a study around it. I recorded an episode of Why Am I Like This called Predictions, Manifestations, and Science, which I should probably find a way to summarize because it's about, I think it's either 2 or 3 hours long. But I talk about some of the characteristics of empirical studies and um, how certain experiences of woo, which I suppose have been like fairly common to me, um, would be very difficult to satisfy some of those characteristics of empirical studies. So I'd be really curious to, yeah, like kind of run some of like the citations that you're talking about under a fine-tooth comb, or perhaps see um, how the people who chose to publish these papers in those journals thought about whether or not to publish them, if that makes sense. Hmm. How does this all kind of make you feel about like the importance of I guess like hard science, or even like the relevance of hard science when it comes to trauma and dissociation and these type of topics that you're really curious about?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the science around these subjects is like some of it might be like scientifically fairly sound, but it's awfully written. Like I cannot read it because it's like cold and awful.
Mm. So would you say that like you're trying to produce something which is like more accessible for a lot of people for whom it might matter to?
More accessible and more humane because I mean, why would anyone want to read papers that feel inhumane?
Mm. Yeah, this feels pretty interesting to me as well on a metaphysical level.
and a lot of papers on trauma are honestly bad and even bizarre. Like an example, there was a paper which wondered like, why do people with trauma when they are like filling these tests out, or like these tests have questions that are supposed to like find out if someone is pretending to have symptoms that they don't. And then the paper was like, why are people with trauma very widely pretending to have these symptoms even though they don't? And
Mm,
like, why would you assume that they don't have these symptoms? They are saying they have these symptoms, and your assumption is like, wow, why are they all lying?
mm. How do they go about testing that hypothesis?
And to me, it seemed like they literally just decide that people cannot have these symptoms.
Mm.
So all these people are just lying. Very strange.
Yeah, I mean, I also question like what it means to lie about something which may be completely subjective, right?
Yeah. But I mean, like the conclusion, like if you interview or ask a lot of people what kind of symptoms they have, and then arbitrarily decide that like, oh, these symptoms are real and these they are just making up. And I that doesn't make any sense to me.
Hmm. Yeah. I guess like a topic which kind of feels like adjacent to this for me is really like the polarity between mimetic fitness and true. And I'm curious if like that lights anything up for you when I say that.
I guess the whole word truth just feels so charged that it's hard to say anything about it.
Hmm. Hmm. I'm kind of feeling into like what that charge might feel like for you. Because I would say like for me, the term truth doesn't really have a charge. Although I can completely understand on a conceptual level why people would say that it has a charge for them. But like to me, I would say like my sense of what truth means feels very clear to me, which is that truth that has to be kind of like interpersonally recognized relates to things which neither of those people question. And then I would say that like on large scales of interpersonalism, you could say, or interpersonalness, that tends to become like very narrow because there are very many people who are very skeptical and who would like to question everything and perhaps only believe that something which has been um, studied empirically and then in a repeated fashion with consistent outcomes and observations um, would be something that they consider true. And then I would say that there are things which I am happy to consider true when it's not possible for another person to have a sense of like whether the first person observed those things or not. Um, but does that sort of, I guess, like, have I provided like enough surface area there for you to, I guess, like offer your own sense of your perspective on truth as it relates to mine?
I guess I would say that truth is aspirational and less realizable. Is that a word? Like I feel like if I'm writing a nonfiction book, I would like the book to present the truth. Yet I feel like that's not possible.
Mm. So maybe it's like possible to present something that people are not going to be able to attack as being untrue,
I
even
would
though
say
that
it's
might
more
not necessarily be.
aspiration, that it aspires to be the truth, but truth is not something that can fully exist or something like that.
Mm. Yeah. I guess like what comes up for me when I think about that is how even if you observe something um, in one empirical study using a particular method, and then somebody repeats that method and they observe the same thing, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that a third study will find the same thing, right?
Yeah.
I think a lot of people would say, well, if this study is repeated and the same thing is observed, then um, we can expect with like a decent amount of certainty that further studies of these things will show the same um, observations or show us the same thing. But to me, that's still a projection, even if it's a projection with a high degree of accuracy. And it wouldn't necessarily, I'd say, like, from my sense of like how truth sits in your field, it wouldn't necessarily be valid to say that whatever is concluded from those repeatable studies is true.
Or maybe I could say that like these studies, they contain a sliver of truth, which is
Mm.
quite different from being the truth.
Mm. Yeah, and I feel like the way this connects to what I was talking about in the why am I like this episode on predictions, manifestations, and science is that I think our understanding of causality is like sort of limited by the degree of locality precision that we're able to observe in space and time. Um, so I think a decent example of this is that like we know um, to a pretty high degree of accuracy and certainty that if a ball hits another ball from a particular angle, then the second ball is going to go off in this direction with this acceleration, let's say. And we have a decent sense, let's say, even of like when it may stop based on like the surface that it's traveling upon. And we might say that the reason or the cause of the second ball moving in the way that we predict relates to um, the mass and the acceleration of and the momentum, let's say, of the first ball and the inertia of the second ball, and that's like the cause, right? But then we don't necessarily know how the particles or even the waveforms that relate to those balls are interacting on a very, very fine-grained level. So like this for me is a concrete example of how our conclusions may contain a sliver of the truth versus like quote the whole truth unquote. Does that feel aligned with, I guess, like what you're gesturing toward?
I think that's one way of looking at it, and there are probably many ways of looking at it.
Hmm. So I guess like yeah, I'm curious to like hear more about like your motivations for writing about trauma and dissociation and also yeah, like how far are you willing to go in territory where it doesn't feel like there is like hard science to back up what you believe?
Yeah, I guess my main motivation is that I feel like this is a super important subject and no one else has gone deep enough. Like there's like, yeah, if you read like trauma literature, it's like, yeah, people like most of our personalities are probably trauma and most relationship problems are trauma. But
Mm.
a lot of this doesn't mention dissociation at all, which I feel is actually very relevant and really like these conclusions are not taken like deep enough because I guess if you're like a world-renowned expert, you don't want to make like too controversial claims. And then it's like, yeah, of course, it's easier to make very controversial claims if you are someone people already trust. And for most people, I'm nobody. So then it's like, why is this nobody saying this or making these extraordinary claims? And there's, of course, the well-known phrase of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which
Mm.
sometimes I feel like I can provide, and sometimes I feel like I can't. And it's like, trust me, bro.
Yeah. What do you feel like are some of like the claims that you would like to make about, well, how do you describe dissociation to begin with?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and a lot of trauma research doesn't really agree on what dissociation means. But there's basically considered to be like two main types of dissociation, and one is structural, which is like your whole mind or personality is fragmented, and the extreme form of this is dissociative identity disorder, or formerly known as multiple personality disorder.
Mm.
And then there is something that's maybe more familiar experientially to many people, where it's more like just zoning out or feeling confused or feeling tired or, oh, I don't want to think about that. I can't remember that.
Mm. So like one of the differences between the first and the second is like, would you say it's like um compartmentalized memories, like a different sense of identity, including like identity markers like one's name, age, gender, etc.
Well, it's really like people's idea of DID is very often that they are these like fully fleshed personalities which have their own names, and they might have a different gender, or they may dress differently and stuff.
Mm.
And I feel like that kind of presentation is fairly rare, but I feel like it's actually very common to have like milder or different forms of this, where the person kind of can give you the impression of being like a one individual, but in reality, they are not really one
Mm.
individual.
Yeah, I would say that it's very common in my experience that I would say, yeah, again, like different flavors of a self can be like more or less present in any given context, even if like those flavors of self end up being combining into a selfhood which responds to the same name and understands, like, let's say, where that self and its body live and what its responsibilities are vaguely to the people who are connected to that self. Um, does that align with your experience?
Yeah. And one thing I want to say about dissociation is that I feel like the literature has not really touched upon at all. Like trauma literature often talks about how trauma research affects trauma researchers. Like if you
Mm.
study people who have been like in a war, you might get secondary trauma because you listen to their really awful trauma stories of the war,
Mm.
right? This is like something that I think most people can very intuitively understand, and it's also being discussed in the research. But the other thing that's not being discussed is that having trauma affects the research that you're actually doing. And the whole nature of dissociation is that it's for hiding and concealing things and not wanting to look somewhere. So
Mm.
if trauma researchers don't want to research dissociation because they are themselves dissociated, then it
Mm.
doesn't happen because the research is not objective. Even if you do a study that's kind of objective, a
Mm.
human being decided to like conduct this study.
Mhm. Right, and they chose to control certain parameters and leave different other parameters of the people who, let's say, people who are included in the study uncontrolled, right?
Yeah, and I actually like I suspect like one thing people are continually confused by is like everyone who treats trauma knows that trauma resides in the body, or whatever you want to call it, but the body is very, very relevant. Yet there's basically no research, or very, very little research on this. And of course, it could be that many people are trying to research this and they are not getting the funding, or it could be that bodies don't want to be researched.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's really relevant to me. Um, First of all, because for the first time in, yeah, I would say like being immersed in, I would say like the Twitter of spiritual science or the x.com of spiritual science, I saw an article which was critical of Bessel van der Kolk's work on, the body keeps the score. I read the article. I thought it was pretty flimsy, so I only read about half of it. But it was the first time I'd seen anything that was critical of that work. And then, yeah, I think something that I've been meditating on for quite some time, and I'd say like doing research on intermittently, but also like people that I know are interested in, is kind of like this question of like, if we believe the body keeps the score, then the question that comes up for me is basically what's the score for any given body at any given time? And I don't feel like it's something that anybody has really asked that I've heard. Apart from like maybe a couple of different people on Twitter, which I think is really surprising given how much traction Bessel van der Kolk's work has received, especially in the last like 4 years, I would say. What like, yeah, is there anything, well, like, what have you read about this which feels incisive, or I guess I would say like pithy to you?
I guess related to what you just said, like I watched a bunch of trauma therapy trainings recently.
Mm.
And it's kind of funny because, of course, most of these people conducting the trainings feel that the body is very important, even if the training is not directly about the body, because the person doesn't consider themselves an expert on like how the trauma is held in the body. But then they are always like, oh, let's talk about trauma. Let's talk about neuroscience. Oh, neuroscience, this, neuroscience, that. We did brain imaging, and brain imaging shows this and that, and neurotransmitters. And it feels kind of phony, like
Mm.
because they don't have the body research. They are very heavily focusing like, oh, look at the brain. Because then it's like if you talk about neuroscience, you're talking about science, which means you're kind of doing something sciencey.
Mm. Yeah. Um, I guess I feel like the container going in like at least a couple of different directions. So I'm kind of tuning into what feels for me like most integrated. But yeah, I guess I'm kind of curious if you're familiar with like I think Dr. Michael Levin's work on like bioelectric fields. And then I think it's Michael Johnson Edwards's work on vasocomputation. And yeah, I guess like I would also throw into that hat like Stuart Hameroff and Sir Roger Penrose's work on microtubules, and maybe Dr. Catherine Clinton's work on like fascia and like quantum field computation. And does that feel like connected either like intuitively or evidentially to like the embodiment of trauma?
I feel like this is like a subject that I should be very interested in because, I have a background, but I just feel like for me personally going in this direction, I don't mean necessarily in this conversation, but like going in this direction in my research would be a distraction, which is why I'm like
And
try to keep just understanding dissociation and on a more societal and phenomenological level. And I figure that the people who understand this understand these aspects of the human body on a more physiological or perhaps even more physics oriented level, there are people
Mm-hmm.
who are studying that, and I can study something else.
Mm. Hmm. I think that kind of connects me back to like one of the other directions I felt the container going in, which is to talk about like, yeah, so like on an interpersonal level, how do you feel like dissociation shows up?
Dissociation is about not wanting to see things. So I feel like it affects almost all human interaction. It's officially there are like 10% of people who dissociate very heavily, and I would
Mm,
say more than half of people probably dissociate in an amount that's very meaningful. So when there are people interacting and one or more of them don't want to see some things or want to see some other things instead of what is happening. So that is kind of affects everything. Like the very old view, like trauma. Trauma is pain. When you have trauma, you have like anxiety or depression, or you're
mm,
crying, drinking, or suicidal or something.
mm,
But dissociation is like a whole different way of looking at it. Like trauma makes people not want to do things or not want to see things or not want to think about things.
mm, mm. And I feel like it's clear to me how um what feels like, yeah, I mean, to me, dissociation as you're describing it feels like a very granular way at looking at how awareness like shapes itself within a container of space and time. And I guess like the way that I understand what you're saying is that like dissociation is something that causes people to perceive some things and not see other things. And then that may shape what a person sees as being like a possible behavior versus like a behavior which is not possible or not perceivable. And then also I'll even say like on a finer grained level, like dissociation can affect um the way that people assess which possibilities are preferential versus like not preferential, which is to say, like, I think maybe more concretely that if somebody is dissociated in some way, they may decide that something is not preferential to them, which, like, let's say, quote, normally, unquote, they may find it preferential. And then, yeah, because of the way in which, like, these possibilities are shaped by dissociation and then choices are kind of assessed for preferentiality by dissociation, it may lead to, you could say, pathologies or um, I'm going to say like behavioral troughs, which can lead to things like depression or anxiety, which are like the more typical effects of trauma, according to like the way I think, yeah, people more typically tend to think of trauma. Does that feel accurate for you?
Yeah, yeah. And I feel like, for example, one thing that gets talked about more and more is something called narcissistic abuse, which
Mm,
kind of is a thing that's very real and awful. And I kind of feel like these terms also completely miss the actual truth or what aspires to be truth for me, which is that 3 years ago I wrote this article which posits that basically all abuse in relationships or behavioral patterns that are like not necessarily abusive but like harmful, or you can call them toxic or whatever,
mm,
they are actually mostly caused by dissociation. And this is not just my view, like there is research on narcissism that kind of agrees with me.
mm,
And if we like the a lot of research on this supposed narcissistic abuse just seems to focus on like how evil these people are, and they're like barely even human, which I feel
Mm,
is a pretty awful way of looking at it. And if you don't realize that dissociation plays a role, you're like missing out a very important piece.
mm. Yeah, I mean, I guess like one of the things that's coming up for me when I'm listening to you talk about this is that, yeah, perhaps like narcissistic behavior is like a subcategory of, yeah, like I would say like a classification of behavior which can arise due to dissociation. And I would say that it probably applies to any behavior which looks like it protects the ego of a person, which is to say that like there's probably like a lot of dissociation which goes on, but dissociation which tends to emit experiences of quote shared reality unquote in a way that is favorable towards a person is often commonly classified as narcissistic, whereas it feels like there's a whole swath of dissociative effects which may cause somebody to actually like undermine themselves or forget things in a way, or not observe or remember things in a way which ends up discrediting them, right? And that's probably less likely to be classified as narcissistic, even though it can still definitely lead to harm in a relationship.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you use the word protection, and protection is the main, like, dissociation exists to protect people. And of course, I don't see it as like pathological. I don't really see anything as pathological. It does not
Mm,
feel like a helpful word to me.
mm,
Or like dissociation is clearly a very important mechanism that exists in people for a reason. If you have too much trauma or too much pain, people generally learn to dissociate and then they suffer less. And it's like it doesn't mean that we should just take all this dissociation away, but it's I feel like it's very helpful to be aware of it and try to figure out like okay, if I dissociate, is it like good for me, or is it bad for me, or is it maybe good for me
mm,
but bad for other people, or something
mm.
like that.
Yeah, something that was kind of coming up for me as I was like laying out that um like categorization, let's say dissociative affects, which can cause someone to be classified as narcissistic versus not, is that even when somebody is being discredited by other people as a result of the ways in which they're dissociating, it can still be protective, right? I think, and that almost kind of brings up for me like um the different ways in which we exist within social structures, because I feel like it's possibly like safer for people to be discredited or perceived as helpless within certain social structures based on many different characteristics of who they are, in ways which maybe yeah, I think like the term learned helplessness is coming up, which is I think generally a pretty charged term, but um that can cause people to be, let's say, protected by the social structures which they're within, such that they don't end up experiencing things which might be very challenging to their personalities, right?
And I this book of mine, the original working title was Info Hazard, and I don't really know how widely known this term is, but it basically means something that is true, but it's harmful for you to know. Like a classic example is the meme called The Game. Everyone who has ever heard of The Game is playing it and you cannot win the game, but every time you hear of the game, you have lost the game. So it does not add anything to your life. It adds a feature of losing the game. Or according to some interpretations of Christianity, if you have never heard of Jesus Christ, you will automatically go to heaven. But if you have heard of him, then
What?
have to believe in him or you go to hell. Which, of course, I'm
Mm,
not saying that is how it works, but info hazards, some information can be harmful, and I'm not entirely sure if the information I'm working with is such information or if some of it can be harmful.
the thing about Jesus kind of feels like a meta info hazard to me, because now parts of me want to know more about how they end up justifying the fact that if people don't hear about Jesus, they'll go to heaven. But it feels like a meta info hazard to me because other parts of me are just like, there are millions of crazy things that people say that aren't necessarily worth trying to understand. But I guess like, yeah, maybe like one of the other ways I could feel the container sort of diverging earlier, which I kind of want to integrate with like the ground that we've covered already, is like, what is your personal experience when you feel like other people are dissociating?
It's a very complex question because dissociation exists in so many forms, and some forms of dissociation in others I may not notice. Some of them affect my autonomic nervous system, like I might get very
Mm,
tired or I might actually get like a bit
mm,
fidgety. And then there are some forms of dissociation that I actually find very upsetting in people. Like some people have this 1,000 yard stare, which makes them look like zombies, which is
mm,
really disturbing to me. Uh,
mm,
then there are like, I mean, I have friends who probably dissociate almost all of the time. So I may
mm,
not even know a version of this person who is not dissociating.
mm, mm. And I feel like this kind of gets to the crux of like why I thought we were going to talk about, CFSME, honestly. Um, and I'll say like as my own offering to this subcontainer, the container of this conversation, um, that yeah, personally for me, what I quote associate unquote with dissociation, not only in other people but also myself, let's say, is like I'll say that when I feel like people are dissociating, I tend to feel things in my body. And then I'll say that if there is something about how they're dissociating that could cause me to dissociate, it feels a certain way in my body, which is to say that it kind of feels like there's something in my body that's trying to eat its way out. And I guess I maybe could have given a content warning there. But then I'll say that concretely, the way I tend to pick up on my own dissociation is one, if somebody tells me I'm dissociating and then I ask my body and my body says yes, is a very concrete for me, right? Because like no one else can feel what my body saying yes feels like. They can maybe see that my neck jerks like 2 or 3 times in a row, which I think you've probably seen when we've spent time together or if like I'm on video with you. Or I'll say like if I can't remember something, it's not always that I would say I was dissociated, which is why I can't remember something, but sometimes I'll just like ask my body if I can't remember it because I dissociated during that experience, and my body will say yes. Um, which I feel like connects to a couple of, I mean, it connects definitely for me to what you were saying about how you feel sometimes fidgety or you feel like tired. Um, and I think it also connects to something you had said to me probably in the Mind is the Gap Discord server a long time ago about the fairly high correlation between people who are like quote mystical unquote and I think it's pronounced ehlers-danlos syndrome.
Yeah.
Um, I guess yeah. Do you want to say a bit more about maybe the second thing first? I'm apologizing for having given you like a forked question, I guess.
Sorry, now I'm not entirely sure what you're even asking. Like, was I supposed to talk about EDS and mystical experiences or dissociation and EDS or
Oh yeah, yeah. Sorry, I'm probably going in too many directions at once, which I've noticed is like a tendency of how my mind tends to work. But maybe you can talk first about EDS or Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and its connection to mysticality for you.
yeah, it's honestly something I don't fully understand. And I mean, EDS is also interesting because, well, there are several different forms, and many of them are considered to be extremely rare. Like some of them are like 1 in 100,000 people has this form of EDS, and they're the thing that connects most of the types is joint hypermobility.
Mm,
And then there's like the most common form is also called joint hypermobility syndrome, but it has like dozens and dozens of other physical effects depending on the person. And yeah, it seems to have a very, very strong connection on being into spiritual stuff. And people have been noticing for a long time, like people who have EDS, and they're like, how is it possible that all my friends also have EDS? And the spirituality connection has maybe come up a bit later, but yeah, I cannot say I really understand. I've heard theories, and many of them are maybe too woo for me or something, but
What
yeah.
are what are some of those theories which are too woo? Is it like info hesitant to even discuss them?
I think I hesitate to bring them up because I haven't paid them so much thought that I might just completely misrepresent what I was even told as someone's theory. But like some of them are related to like the joint hypermobility is basically relates to how the whole body is kind of more floppy in a way, like the tissue integrity is not as high as it's maybe should be.
Mm-hmm.
And one theory I've heard that this relates to like the mind or the body mind also being more open. So when
Mm,
your body is kind of messed up in a certain way, you become open to spiritual stuff. And I guess like that's a theory that yeah, maybe it has some truth to it. And some theories are more related to like the spiritual evolution of humankind and
mm,
people carrying this stuff in their DNA for a reason and so on. But
right.
it's what I was going to say before I distracted myself was that for these more rare types of EDS, they have generally found the genes, like a mutation in this gene causes this form of EDS. And
Mm,
the most common type, which is now thought to affect several percent of people, is considered genetic, but no one has been able to find the gene.
mm. So it's like heritable basically and maybe immutable, but no one's necessarily like identified um yeah, which gene is responsible for this characteristic showing up.
Yeah, and I feel like it's kind of curious that there's this condition that's considered genetic and several percent of people have it. So it's a huge amount of people and no one really knows what's causing it. And of course, there's a bunch of studies that are pointing in some directions that may or may not be helpful.
Mm,
But honestly, like the whole EDS thing has been something I've been thinking out for Yeah, I think like 20 years now,
Wow.
but I also really like understood the connection to spirituality a few years ago, and I still don't
Mm.
really understand it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like maybe the second thing I can ask about is the connection between EDS and CFSME.
Yeah, yeah. This is something where I feel a bit more confident saying something. So yeah, this connection was discovered like maybe 20 years ago or a bit more. And my doctor Olli Polo, or my former doctor, has a lot of theories about this. And one of the main theories was that the blood vessels are like too dilated and they don't constrict properly. And
Mm,
as a result, the body produces too many chemicals like adrenaline and noradrenaline, and which constrict the blood vessels. And in the in the long run, and especially if there are insults like infections, this kind of completely wears out the sympathetic
mhm.
nerve. It's like the theory is obviously much more complex and nuanced, but this is like a very simplified version.
Yeah, like that's the fundamental mechanism which causes
Yeah.
CFSME. Interesting. And yeah, I guess like could you say I feel like I have like a intuitive sense, let's call it, of like how that connects to EDS, but can you like maybe make that connection a little bit more concrete for me or for anybody else who might be listening?
Sorry, what part of that? Like
The
how
con
how did
the
blood?
connect sorry, the connection between like the I guess the hyperdilation of blood vessels and um yeah, EDS or uh yeah, joint hypermobility.
Yeah, yeah. So the joint hypermobility is just like it's a bit of a like crappy name, like because it takes too much attention. Like the first theories about this connection were something like, yeah, well, people who have hypermobile joints, their joints like get fatigued, and that's where their body kind of like wears out, and they develop
Mm,
SME or something like that.
mhm,
And that is like the problem in EDS is collagen, which is like in all of your tissues. So the blood vessels are also affected, the muscles are affected,
mhm,
basically everything in the body is affected.
mhm. That makes sense to me. I guess the other thing that was coming up for me when you were talking about EDS is that, yeah, I'd say like some of the things that you were describing as maybe a little bit too woo are things that I've never read about EDS, but feel intuitively true to me, which, you know, like not saying a whole lot, because like we don't even understand how intuition works, right? But it feels to me that um, there is a connection between particularly like fascia and the interstitium, and uh, I'd say that like it feels fairly close to. It feels like one of the more proximal artifacts of trauma, or you know, like I'd even say that like the way that I'm referencing trauma when I talk about it in this way is maybe a little bit too far away from how people tend to talk about trauma. But I'll say that I think that one of the effects of trauma is that there are certain modes within our somatosensory cortices which are no longer activatable, let's say, because of you know what in acoustic engineering you'll probably talk about in terms of dampening. Um, but yeah, let's say that like there are certain ways in which yeah bioelectric fields can and cannot propagate in the somatosensory cortices, which end up meaning that certain sensations cannot be registered within the somatosensory cortices, and also that um, certain motor plans cannot be created or executed in the body. which I would say tends to lead towards um, the different tissues of the body which are implicated in motor plan execution being conditioned in a certain way. And I guess like the way that connects to yeah, I would say like porosity or like the openness of a body to spirituality um is that yeah, I think like the way that motor plans are executed in the body is highly contingent upon particular like networks of communication being alive and communicating in particular ways. And when the body cannot communicate in those ways, it may leave those communication networks open to communication from outside the body. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
And I think like the reason it doesn't necessarily connect to how most people tend to think of trauma is because I think most people tend to think of trauma as stuff that happens in the experience of your present lifetime. Whereas I feel like when some of these affects arise from, well, like let's say they're like inherited, and I would say like not very mutable or like approaching complete immutability, then I'd say like it probably relates to trauma which happens to lifetimes that we're connected to genetically or epigenetically, or even I would say hologenetically, which is to, I guess, like reference the idea that we can be connected to the experiences of different incarnations of our souls, which is like, I fully understand that I'm going into fairly deep blue at this point, and I'm pretty far off the reservation when it comes to like empirical verifiability or things which have been empirically verified in a repeated way. But to me, instead of saying trauma, it might feel more fitting to use the word karma. I'm curious what comes up for you. I know I was talking for quite a while.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is really, really something that I just don't want to say much about. Like it does not feel true to me, but who knows what it even means.
Mm. Is there anything about it which feels like particularly like shaky to you?
Yeah, it just but like the whole when we start talking about like past lifetimes, even if it is like in the context we have like a context of genes here, which literally connect us to on a very physiological level to our past lifetimes in a
Mm,
sense. But then when we start talking about the stuff like trauma and sorry, karma and chronic illness and disability, it just
mm,
it gets very icky. And that doesn't mean that there cannot be truth or slivers of truth there, but
mm.
it's complicated.
Yeah, I definitely feel like I have some exposure to some of the comments which people have been making about the connection between karma and chronic illness. And, um, I think perhaps like most famously in my experience, there was uh, the coach of the English national football team, Glenn Hoddle, was known for being a client of a psychic, and that psychic had told him that people who have disabilities, um, particularly like heritable and non-mutable disabilities, were quote like paying for stuff that was happening and or had happened in a past life unquote, or that they had like chosen to incarnate that way. And I definitely disagree with that. Um, and I would also say that the way that people tend to think of karma as in like something bad was done at some point, whether it's in the present life or a past life or an ancestral lifetime, and therefore somebody has to atone for something which was done, which was bad. I would say even that, which is I think like a fairly common interpretation of karma, feels completely false to me. Um, I think for me, like karma is basically like, like we see in our lifetimes all the time that people get away with bad stuff. Like maybe they don't get away with it in the sense that like they've done stuff which people know is bad in a very public way, and then they continue to get away with it. But I feel like most of us have seen people do stuff which feels morally reprehensible and not end up quote suffering for it. Um, I feel like for me, karma is more that like every action that we take, including like perceiving something in like a formal way, which is to say like in like a no longer like primordial like void type of way, has an affect, and then that affect tends to have other knock-on effects, and all of these knock-on effects basically mingle and create very complex effects, um, which I don't think it's appropriate to connect to some of those causal chains in a morally legible way. Does that make sense? Which is to say,
Yeah.
like, really simply, I don't think that people with chronic illness are paying for something that they did, which is bad. I just feel like, like even standard like heritability of genetic material and the characteristics which arise as that genetic material um, is, I'll say, like expressed in like the growth of a body. That's also karma, right? Like whether those affects are good or bad, it's just like this is what the magnificent machines that are our bodies do sometimes. Um, and there's no morality at that level. Um, but yeah, to go back to what you're saying in terms of like what feels sticky about it, I guess like what I feel like I'm dismembering is like an interpretation of what I was saying that implies that people who suffer from chronic illness, quote, deserve it, quote, because that's not at all how I think about how karma works or like what I'm saying. Um, I guess like maybe another way of approaching what I was like perhaps like connecting is like when you were talking about like the research that you've been doing on trauma research, and then also your understanding of like the effects of trauma research on trauma researchers, one of the things that came up for me is that like um it feels like a vector of transmission, the way that I see these things. And I'm kind of curious if you have experienced doing research on trauma in a way which aligns with that characterization.
I mean, I feel like I do research on trauma in two mostly separate and distinct ways.
Mm.
Um, One is reading literature, reading books, reading articles, watching videos, so on. And one is my practical work, helping people with trauma, which often is much more helpful in teaching me stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And because it teaches me stuff through patterns, and when I see same stuff happening or unfolding over and over again, and then it's like, okay, I'm probably not making this up. Why is this not in the literature? I don't know, but it seems like it's an actual thing. And definitely transmission is happening there in lots of ways.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I guess like it feels connected to me in the sense that you talked about like your experience of dissociation relating to fatigue or feeling drained or fidgeting, and I guess I'm curious, like, um, yeah, like, do you have a sense of like what's happening there in like a metaphysical way that's causing you to experience dissociation in that way?
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about it in lots of different ways because we can use the word energetic, and but I feel like some of it is something that even materialist people accept because there are concepts like co-regulation, which literally means that people's nervous systems affect other people's nervous systems. And of course, if there is co-regulation, there is co-dysregulation, which I feel like
Mm,
be much, much more common because most nervous systems are all over the place and
mm,
it affects a lot of the other nervous systems as well. And my nervous system is like mostly well regulated in some ways, but then when someone is like extremely agitated or extremely dissociated, then it's like, huh, I feel this in my body in this way.
mm. And yeah, I mean, I feel like a particularly skeptical person might say that like co-regulation slash co-dysregulation might happen because the person who has, let's say, like a specific nervous system state may say things, and then the second person may receive those things. And when they receive those things, they interpret those sounds, they turn them into words in their brain, and then that lights up different memories. Then those memories could be dysregulating, which causes their nervous system to become dysregulated. And then maybe they say things which have the same effect on the first person. And this is like perhaps like a very materialistic like explanation for how co-regulation or co-dysregulation can work. Of course, like it can happen the other way where you can like say things or make certain sounds which light up memories which are more regulating. Um, but like my sense is like that's not necessarily like a complete enough explanation from your perspective, but please.
I also don't feel like that's the actual materialist explanation for most people because that's considered like such a like a fairly widely accepted phenomenon.
Mm,
So I think it's considered like the materialist explanation is more like people are very attuned to other people. So if like someone's heart is beating very fast and they are breathing rapidly and like you can tell someone is agitated even if it's not necessarily like a conscious experience.
mm,
People pay attention to like other people's like skin tone or pupil size and
mm,
like all kinds of things. That's what people do.
mm,
So I think even if you regard this in like a fully materialist way, which I don't, but I feel like whatever, if you use the materialist explanation, you still get it mostly right.
mm. There's another materialistic explanation I've heard from, I think I've talked about this with you, which is like the Heart Math Institute, where they talk about how the electromagnetic fields of people's like hearts are sometimes very large. And they there is like a way in which like one person's electromagnetic field can regulate the other person's electromagnetic field through the heart space. But my reading of this study is that it wasn't necessarily clear if those people were able to observe each other or whether they were held separate from each other in a way which would negate some of the explanations around, like observing someone's skin tone or the size of their pupils or like whether they were fidgeting, etc. Let alone like whether or not they were actually like talking to each other. Um, So that's something which I feel like, yeah, I would like to see more research about. Um, but then I guess I'm curious. I'll say that like I've definitely had the experience when I can't see somebody and also when I can't hear them saying anything. I've had the experience in my body which feels the same as when somebody is speaking or I can see them, and I associate it with dissociation. And often um shortly afterwards, or like when they do start speaking, then they tend to say things which I correlate with an experience of dissociation, which to me implies that there is even an affect which can occur non-locally, right? Because the electromagnetic field of the heart is relatively large compared to the electromagnetic field of the brain. But usually when I'm on Zoom with somebody, they are thousands of kilometers away. Um, and then of course, yes, like very skeptical people could say that like the lack of talking could be seen as some like a leading indicator of dissociation. But I'll say that A, it's not always that I can't see someone and they're not talking that I feel this thing happening in my body. And B, I would say that the same applies to when I'm sitting in silence with somebody and also when I'm just texting with somebody and there is no like dot 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 which shows that they're typing. And I'm kind of curious if you've had similar experiences.
I would say I like there's definitely a non-local aspect to this and something that can be perceived by being in like just writing to someone. But I feel like the autonomic nervous system effect is much more pronounced when there is some kind of like it could be just a Zoom call, but like I feel like the like that's probably related to the materialist explanation, and then the energetic explanation is more related to like the emotional side, like I if I'm on a Zoom call, I might pick up both someone's autonomic nervous system state and their emotional state, and through text it might be more about the emotional state.
Mhm. And you would say like you'd pick up aspects of their autonomic nervous system state based on like being able to see them and how they behave.
Yeah, it seems like it's partially at least connected to that. But of course, this is very complicated, and even separating like emotions and autonomic nervous system, blah blah blah, is
Mm,
like, yeah, but
mm, mm. So then, like, I guess going back to what you were saying about like how this happens and how co-regulation works, I guess, yeah, I'm feeling into how to ask a question about, yeah, like, I mean, how do you feel like CFSME might exacerbate some of like your felt experiences of dissociation, like on a physical level?
yeah, it's a very good question, and now I hope I can actually, because I wanted to say some more stuff about EDS, which is more on the physiological level,
Uh,
which related to this. But yeah, so like my doctor's idea is that in CFSME, the sympathetic nervous system is kind of collapsed. This is a word that he has used. And of course, you could say that, oh, if the sympathetic nervous system has collapsed, this must be the same state as, freeze, which is like a trauma reaction
mhm,
where the parasympathetic nervous system dominates,
mhm,
which is like, yeah, kind of, but it's not the same. And also, the autonomic nervous system does not have one state. This is a very common misconception that someone
mm,
like in fight or flight, or they are in freeze, or they are like in a calm,
Mm,
regulated state. The person can be like different parts of the body can be in different nervous system states, which I feel
mm,
like really also relates to IFS.
mm,
Yeah, it's curious to me that I can have a physical illness that is strongly related to the autonomic nervous system, while I feel like my autonomic nervous system is very well regulated in some other ways. But it also is not as controversial or impossible as it may sound.
mm. I mean, I guess like what comes up for me is like when, yeah, like talking about like the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system as it's as if like, yeah, your nervous system is in only one of these states. Um, like honestly, like what comes up for me is like an orchestra, right? And it's like sometimes some of the instruments are playing at full volume and some of them are completely silent. I think like very often within a particular composition, all of the instruments will be playing at some volume between, complete silence and like maximum volume. And that's not even like starting to talk about like what notes these instruments are playing or whether these notes are parts of the same scales, right? Which is to say, like, are they consonant or dissonant or harmonious? Um, and I'm sure, like, it's very clear to me that I'm speaking about this metaphorically, but I feel like what I'm trying to gesture at is like the complexity of nervous system states. And I'm kind of, yeah, I'm curious if that aligns with your understanding of how a nervous system can express itself.
It does feel like, according to my understanding, that it's a pretty good metaphor, but it's funny to me how little this is discussed. Like recently, I read a book on the autonomic nervous system, which had like one page, or it had like one infographic, which demonstrated the way that different parts of the body can be in a different autonomic nervous system state. And that's it. There was like no explanation on like the real implications of this.
Mm,
And in general, like the autonomic nervous system, like recently a client asked me, like, what are you like? Yes, my previous book has like one page on the autonomic nervous system. And
mm,
some people have taken this to mean that I don't think it's very important, which is not true at all. I just didn't really have
mm,
more I could confidently say about it, but
mm.
I feel like it's super important, literally, because your body is always in like an autonomic nervous system state or states. Like you
Like,
cannot exist in like a way you're not like, you might be in freeze, you might be in fight or flight, you might be in both, you might be well
right,
regulated, but there's no way to exist outside of these states.
right. Like this is like it's not necessarily like where consciousness is located, but as long as you are conscious, there's going to be some kind of state there.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess like to extend like the metaphor, which maybe feels like acceptable at this point, like it isn't necessarily too surprising to me that, let's say, like the song of your lifetime may not contain any parts where, um, let's say, like somebody hits the timpanis very hard, which is to say that you become like very dysregulated. Um, while perhaps, yeah, like maybe like in the composition, there are certain instruments which like never get played, right? Um, I think understanding the autonomic nervous system through the lens of this metaphor makes those things very, very conceivable. And I feel like you could probably say that, like, um, yeah, like if you were to transpose a classic rock song so it can be played by an orchestra, like you could probably just give many of the instruments a complete vacation. Um, which is probably how I would describe the state of insanity, which I refer to as like normalcy. Um, But hmm, I'm kind of feeling into like the duration of this container, and I guess I feel like in some sense like we're kind of like rounding the final bend and like going into the home straight, so to speak. But I definitely feel like there was something that you mentioned with regard to CFSME and yeah, I would say like your experience of dissociation, which feels like I can maybe tune in a little bit more into it. And I'm wondering if anything else comes up. You mentioned that there was stuff that you wanted to say about EDS.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to say like yeah, the collagen is like the main thing in EDS, and it's like all your tissues are kind of messed up in some ways, but also there's a way that people with EDS are much more often neurodivergent, like autistic. There's a
Mm,
very, very strong connection. And some theories are like, oh yeah, because collagen is also affects brain development to some extent, and some believe it's something different. Then people with ADS also tend to be queer, LGBT more often.
mm,
There's there's no clear. There are of course there are theories, but there's no clear explanation. And
mm,
then there are some things also like people with EDS tend to have some immune deficiencies that are also like the collagen stuff doesn't really explain them. And
mm.
yeah, I don't know if some of these are relevant to the spirituality side. They might be.
Yeah. I mean, definitely like that, the author I mentioned earlier, her name is Dr. Catherine Clinton, talks a lot about the organization of fascia, and collagen is like a very important component of fascia. And I think like for me, this like connects very directly to um yeah, I would say like the sonorousness of the somatosensory cortex, cortices. Um, so yeah, it feels pretty intuitively tractable, but not necessarily conceptually tractable, that there is a connection between collagen and I'll say like spiritual openness, but not necessarily spiritual um, resilience is the term that's coming up. And it feels really spicy and controversial to talk about resilience or like spiritual openness, or I purposely didn't use the term spiritual integrity or disintegrity in the context of, people being explicitly spiritual or queer or like all of these things. But I think it's like also noticeable to me that like some of the most spiritually integrated practitioners I know are pretty queer. Not necessarily in the ways which are like commonly represented um, as queer, I would say. But like I'd say that um, personally speaking, and like I'm not saying like I'm completely spiritually integrated, but I'll say that like the more integrated I become spiritually, the less typically sexual I am, which is not to say that I become more homosexual or become even more heterosexual, but I would say that like many of the things which I tended to associate with sexual attractiveness no longer have the same effect on me. I'd say that like attractiveness as being something which is highly correlated with like particular modes of physicality or appearance becomes less and less true for me the more that I integrate spiritually. And I would say that like I hesitate to even use the term attraction, but I would say that like the parts of my body that used to respond to what I thought was sexual attraction no longer respond in that way. And then I would say that like my affinity with people feels like it no longer correlates very well to certain physicalities or appearances. And I would say it tends to correlate more highly with, I would say, spiritual integrity, which is to say that I feel more affinity with spiritually integrated people, and it lights me up in a way which feels like similar to the way that physical attraction used to light me up. But to me, what drops into my channel in association with that is like my sense of like someone's vitality, more so than like what I would have previously called their attractiveness. Um, and yeah, I would say that it um, it doesn't feel like very like highly correlated with like physicality at all sometimes. Even though I think the term vitality could perhaps be like egregorically connected with that. Does that make sense for you? Or does it feel like iffy to you in any way?
I guess personally, for me, the term vitality feels very charged also because it has this like health slash illness vibe to it, even if it's not necessarily meant in that way, or it could be.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, like it feels like a really like woo thing to me, but you know, like when people say Tao that can be spoken is not eternal Tao, I feel like that's kind of like what I'm trying to get at when I say that like spiritual integrity is not necessarily like very easily correlated to like physical health. To say that many people who like appear to be physically healthy don't seem particularly vital to me. Many people who maybe aren't necessarily like typically physically healthy seem like they're more vital to me. And the way that I guess is coming up for me to explain that is that I think that like somebody's effect on like life itself often extends way beyond like their own lifetime, if that makes sense. So it's like, you know, like somebody could live for a relatively short period of time, but they could like increase the life-givingness of many people and the life-givingness of those people to other people, etc. Um, Whereas, yeah, I think like there are people who could live like a very long time who mostly reduce the life on Earth and the life of other beings by, you know, I think typically we would kind of call them vampires. Um, I'm feeling into the container to see if like there's anything else that can be gathered, but I'm kind of curious like how you're feeling. Do you feel like there's anything else that you would like to offer to this container?
I feel like it's, these are subjects that I could spend hours talking about, but it feels like, yeah, it's like now is a good time to end rather than going for 9 more hours.
Um, yeah, I I'm definitely feeling into parts of me that want to like, you know, get to the bottom of like the thing that we're talking about, which feels completely impossible to most of us. So I'm
Yeah, we
dismembering
solved everything.
I'm dismembering those parts of it because I think like they are kind of just a little bit like tiny little hungry ghosts which are like flying around in my, I guess I'll say spicily like autonomic nervous system. But yeah, I guess I'll say it for now. Thank you so much for inviting me into this container. Um, and thank you for those who were able to come live, even if momentarily. And I'm looking forward to seeing what the recording is like because honestly, I think like some of the things that we were talking about as being like energetic affects which can be felt because of dissociation probably also I would say that like they occur in the same non-local fields which may cause interference in internet connections. But is there anything else that you would like to say before we close the container?
Not really, other than thanks for having me. And yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Talk to you soon. I'm sure I'll talk to you right after this, in fact. Cheers.
Okay,
Good night.
bye.